Hello, and welcome back to the America First Energy Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wilson. If you tuned into our last episode, you got to hear just a little bit about the work that I do for Energy Right, which mainly focuses on Southwest Virginia. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by the current chair of the Scott County Board of Supervisors and native Southwest Virginian himself, Chris Maness. After I chat with him, like always, Skyler will join me and we will chat through recent headlines. Alrighty, well, thank you, Chris, for being here with us today. I'm going to start before we get into questions. I want to just highlight a few things from your bio for the audience. So, you are the current chairman of the Scott County Board of Supervisors. And it's your first term, I believe, as a supervisor in Scott County. You're also a longtime software engineer. And, these two, balancing public service and software engineering, gives you a pretty unique perspective in terms of energy and high tech industry and how to balance that in a rural community like Scott County. But wanted to just give you an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself as we get started, what drew you to public service there, but also your time as a software engineer.
Yeah. So, I grew up in Scott County and, I've always just loved it here. Love the mountains, love the rivers, love the people. And, you know, our our family, my family, my wife and I, we kind of have a family mission statement, right? And it says that, we want to be the best we can be for our community, to find where we, make wherever we end up the best it can be. So that's part of getting involved with local government, and just trying to help, push the community forward there.
I know you come also from an agricultural background, having grown up in Scott County. It's
Yeah.
a lot of agriculture there. So yeah, just give us a little bit about what brought you to software engineering, having grown up on a farm.
Yeah, yeah. It's an odd fit, I will tell you that. I grew up on a farm. We used to grow tobacco back when that was profitable, but we switched to beef and hay, as that became more profitable. And as I grew up, in the early 2000s and in the heyday of the computer and all that. And I don't know, there was just something about it uh, that I enjoyed. I enjoyed the puzzle. I enjoyed figuring things out. A lot of people you see with computers, they get frustrated or aggravated. I'm sure you have as well, and most of the audience members have. But I always just saw that as a challenge and thought, I can make this thing do whatever I want. And so, that kind of grew into a love of that. And when I was going to college, I didn't really know what I was going to be. And at the start, I thought, hey, I may be like a graphic designer or maybe a chemical engineer. But once I sat down and really started like digging into that, into software engineering, I loved it and I was hooked. And so that has gone with me ever since. Much to the chagrin of my family, because I'm an only child. So I do still work and help out on the farm, but it's a little bit different than if I was doing it, full
Right.
time. So
Right. So, as and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe so. You grew up in Scott County, but then you moved and went to school out of state, and then spent some time maybe in North Carolina before you came back to Scott County. So, give us a little bit of a rundown of what it means to a lot of people in whether it be Appalachia, Scott County. They're there for a long time.
yeah.
What has going to school out of state and then working out of state a little bit and now coming back to Scott County, how has that changed your perspective on the area?
Yeah, so I'm not necessarily going. I did go to school out of state, but ETSU is probably still in the same region, I would
Right.
consider it. So regionally, it was still very much the same, but it's the experience of like getting out and living other places and seeing other people and other ways of doing things. In Knoxville for a little bit, I worked at the Department of Energy there when I lived there, and then came back to get my master's, and then left to go to Wilmington. Had a number of software and data analysis jobs there, and it gives you a completely different perspective on how a community can be run, and what a community can be, how everything can work together.
Right. So I think having come back to the community, like you say, there's a new appreciation for new ideas, and I imagine coming now into public service, that's something you bring with you. So talk to us a little bit about. You spoke to it a little bit, but what does public service mean to you, and kind of integrating what you just said. How do you take what you've learned into your service as a supervisor in Scott County?
I've always been service minded, and like I said, our family has kind of oriented around that as one of our goals. And I never thought about it in the broader prospect until I came back in 2021. And when we came back in 2021, we saw this community, which I grew up in and I loved. And my wife is just from across the state line, so she's, you know, lived in the same community, and we've seen saw this community kind of hollowed out by COVID and by the opioid epidemic, right? It had just ravaged this area, and something had to be done. And there were people working on it, and I don't discount anyone's work on it up to this point, but I think they needed someone in there with new ideas that has seen what a community could be, what a region could be. And I ran on my love for the community, but also, hey, we can do so much more than what we're doing. Scott County is really a wonderful county, especially for business or access to roads or access to land. With 15th largest county in Virginia, so we've got a lot of stuff going for us, but we've just never been able to make much of all of our assets. So that's
Right.
something I've really tried to help us drill into.
Right. So, talking about industry and business and growth, especially in a new era of growing and constantly changing technology. You have, like you said, worked in and around both energy and AI or budding technology for a long time now. So,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about, give us some context, your perspective on both growing new technologies, particularly AI, and maybe how that relates to industry and or energy, excuse me, and then also give us a little bit of context on how that might impact Scott County, what those opportunities might be, and what those challenges related to that industry growth might be for Scott County.
Yeah, energy, as far as AI goes, energy is probably going to become the number one commodity, number one input commodity for AI. And that's going to be the ability to generate energy either, behind the meter or on the meter, wherever they can, because that is probably the most intensive input that you've got. And you can find silicon just about anywhere on the planet, and you can find you know, places to put data centers, but finding places where you have enough land to generate energy and to do that is something that's going to be probably the biggest challenge. And, I know a lot of people hear AI every day, they hear it on the news, they're not in the trenches digging on it. This is I was a little bearish on it at first, I'll admit, because I've seen how AI works in the past, and I've
Right.
built systems and things like that,
Sure.
and I was like, okay, yeah, this is a new model type that we've come out with the advent of like large language models that
Right. Right.
people like OpenAI and Anthropic have come out with. Um, I was a little bit bearish on it because of yeah, it's not going to be that good. But as it is developed and have as people more creative than me have figured out, how to build and use this, it's going to be truly transformative.
Right.
It will be to us as big as the dot-com boom, and I don't know that we'll have a bust during this one.
Right.
There's a lot of people that are saying, "Oh yeah, people will get disillusioned with AI," but a lot of the products that are coming out are better than I would have ever imagined, and they're it's starting to be a revolution, really.
Right. And it's like
It's going to be a
continue.
revolution for my job.
Right. Well, exactly. And it's continually getting better. I mean, it feels like every, week or two we're seeing something new come out or a new development or, I even using, AI from time to time in my work, you see changes even just subtly and it getting better, et cetera. But like you say, it's something that is so energy intensive that we got to figure out a way to generate that energy. And part of that is the local governments, is particularly in Virginia, right? For a lot of this energy infrastructure, whether it be natural gas or nuclear or solar or wind or hydro, local governments have a pretty singular role in terms of providing the pathway forward for these and laying the groundwork for new energy generation or new grid infrastructure. So talk to us a little bit about how you see the role of local government, whether that be elected officials like yourself or staff, as we continue to pursue American made energy generation, and what challenges in terms of course, there are some pretty glaring challenges as it relates to aging infrastructure, but what are some other challenges as a local government representative that you see in that effort to permit and site new energy generation?
Yeah, so the big thing going forward, especially for Virginia counties, is that it is more expensive to build the infrastructure to transport the energy than it is just to build the infrastructure to generate the energy. So at the end of the day, that means the counties that have the most energy generation on the ground are going to be the counties that are going to win for that. And that is all types of energy generation, right? I like to joke that every megawatt matters, right?
Right,
Every
right,
every megawatt matters, no matter where you can get it from. It's going to help your local grid, and it's going to help your county to grow in the future. A lot of people say, especially in regards to AI, and I'll keep coming back to that because that is the argument that I'm most familiar with. This is the most expensive and the worst it'll ever be. It is a lot of the sentiment out there, but also this is the least energy that it'll ever use
right,
right now. So our energy usage is just going to keep growing exponentially. So that then falls back on us as a county to look and say, hey, you know, there is a new opportunity coming out here. There's a new industry. How can we support this industry? How can we build things in our community that will, not only help this industry, but help any other industry that wants to locate here? That's anytime you have any type of manufacturing facility or thing item like that warehouse, they're going to have power needs, right? And
right,
the power needs are going to be on the ground, and you're going to have to figure out, where am I going to get a spare 3 megawatts from?
right,
And that 3 megawatts may mean that you get 1,000 jobs.
right,
And millions of dollars of investment. So, our role is really to look and see, where the opportunities are coming from, where this industry is going, and then make intelligent decisions that benefit everyone, right? A lot of times when, you have these type of projects, it feels like they only benefit the landowner, right?
right.
Because there is a very obvious dollar
Sure.
transaction going on there, but it can benefit the whole. It can benefit the whole county through jobs. It can benefit the whole county through resiliency of infrastructure.
Right.
So those are just some of the things that I like to think about when we're going through these talks.
Right. Well, and I will say too, of course, we'll chat about this in a little bit as well, but Scott County has worked on some new solar projects that were presented to the county over the last 6 months or so. And one of the things that Scott County's done, to your point about investing in the community, is really directed investment on the front end of these projects to your local fire and EMS. So talk a little bit about, whether it's solar or other generation, just to wrap up here, what is the role of this new energy generation in terms of, like you say, county resiliency?
Yeah, so we have been very adamant from the start with these new energy projects that hey, you all have to be a good neighbor, and part of being a good neighbor is investing in the community up front, and that is something we need. If you look in the news lately, especially if you look in like Cardinal News, there was an article that said Scott County was one of the least funded EMS fire and EMS in the whole state. I think it was us in Dickinson County down there in the bottom tier. And those are all volunteer,
Right.
mostly volunteer fire departments, EMS. So we have to do something. to continue to improve that, because that's part of the county. That's part of our needs in the
Right.
county. And so we've been really intentional about directing that, initial siding fee to those agencies and helping, bolster those up, because a lot of times these projects are going into rural communities anyways, where there
Right.
isn't much money, where there isn't much fundraising that can be done for these departments, but they have a greater need, right?
Right.
You think about it, you have more people over 60. That means you're going to have more ambulance calls. That's just the way that it is. And these communities have traditionally been underinvested in, and we're really trying to up that investment to kind of
Right.
change that calculus there.
Right. And it's that investment kind of all over, like you say, in these communities that don't necessarily have a growing workforce, but finding other ways to invest in them is essential for building a
Yeah.
future for the rest of the county as well. Well, Chris, I think that's a good point to take a break. For
Okay.
our audience, we'll be back in just a few minutes, so stick with us as we return with a conversation with Chris Maness. Thanks. Alrighty, well, welcome back to the America First Energy Podcast. I'm here with Chair of the Board of Supervisors from Scott County, Chris Maness. Chris, I really enjoyed the first half of our conversation, but I want to jump back in, following up on something that we highlighted briefly, which is you guys in Scott County have, I guess, since late last year, but really over the last 4 months, have been looking at multiple different solar projects, particularly proposed shared solar projects, which for our audience are smaller projects, about 5 megawatts or less. But in these discussions about solar, of course, there were some hot conversations. Of course, solar siting and permitting is a contested issue in many communities. So I want to chat a little bit with you about how you, as a public servant, as an elected leader, how you balance the concerns of the community, wanting economic development and that investment, understanding the need for energy generation locally. How do you balance those types of issues that are so hotly contested?
Yeah, so that's a hard thing to do, especially in a rural community where you've got a lot of misinformation floating around. I really saw that during the siting of these, especially around, like the safety and the efficacy of solar panels, and people were even concerned about, having energy generation infrastructure in general in the community. One gentleman was, worried about how much voltage was going to be on the lines, right? So it all really starts with the ordinance. You have to have I think you have to have a good place to start for both you and the developer and the public. And that is the ordinance that we have passed. And it kind of gives everyone an idea of things that we're looking for and how that goes along. And then as far as the public goes, the public has to the public has to understand that we've got to balance these decisions, and that we're not the end all be all of these decisions, right? Virginia Department of DEQ is going to also look at it. So there are going to be people that are more qualified to look at some of these issues and some of these concerns than us at the local level, and we're just trying to make sure that this development fits into our community and gives us some benefit, and that doesn't interrupt everyone's lives that much. And that's really what our ordinance was designed to do, is to make sure that, hey, we don't want to disrupt everyone's lives
Right.
a ton. Progress requires a little disruption, but we want to kind of balance that,
Right.
and do what's best, for the community. And the fact that these have been shared solar projects, that makes it an even easier ask of the community, right? When it's benefiting everyone. So,
Right. Yeah, and I think you talk about, I mean, these ordinances, when crafted responsibly, when you work with the community, hear their comments, and really, put a good ordinance that's responsible in place, it provides that space for balanced development, right? Recognizing that, change is inevitable in many ways, but we want to do it in a way that's conducive to the community, and having a good ordinance, like you say, is kind of one way to protect down the line, and it makes sure that any actor, whether it's housing development or solar development, or pick your type of development, they have an idea of what it means to be a partner in Scott County or your community, or just making sure that they're following the rules that you guys have set. Talking about that a little bit more, economic development investment, not just solar but other types of investment. that requires planning on the part of staff, on the part of supervisors. So here I want to chat a little bit about, for you, what does good economic development look like in Scott County? But then two, how do you and your colleagues on the board of supervisors work with the rest of the officials in the county to provide for that economic development? What does that look like in Scott County?
Yeah, so economic development is something that I've had to learn about on the job, right? I came in with this conception that economic development is just jobs. And when you look at it that way, a lot of economic development doesn't really look like it's benefiting anyone, right? It just looks like it's there to benefit the manufacturer, the
Right.
creator, the developer. But you have to look at economic development down a number of different pathways. One is the investment in your community. How much money are they bringing and investing in your community? You got to look at jobs, right? But you don't need to only look at jobs that a particular development has, right?
Right.
Whether that's a factory or a solar panel farm. You don't need to just look at the jobs that it has, but you need to look at the jobs downstream that it creates.
Right.
I was racking my brain before this to think of like I wonder how many jobs we can create per megawatt. And I did some Googling, and the only metrics that I could find were people saying, this is the employment of like a coal-fired facility, gas-fired facility, a solar facility, as far as jobs per megawatt. They don't look at the downstream effects of like how many jobs that we can create.
Right.
Here in Duffield, we have, a factory that uses about 3 megawatts of power, right? And having 9 extra megawatts of power in the grid means that we could support three more factories like that. And they
Right.
employ, I think, around 300 people at this one, maybe a little less than that. You'll have to check my numbers on that. But if we can tie that to that, then we can start to really have a good conversation about what this means down the road. And it just kind of goes hand in hand there.
Right. And I think to your point, those second and third and fourth order effects, right? Really thinking about solar farms, you've got, your temporary construction and maybe a handful of people that are going to be working long term on the project. But what you're thinking about is, Main Street is going to have more customers at the pizza joint, right? Or there's going to be more people at the local market buying groceries every week because they're doing construction for 6 to 8 months, right? It's those kind of things that we want to really continue to think about as we are considering these projects, or really any kind of development in a community, really thinking about what are the long-term economic impacts that kind of ripple out, right? Like a stone in water. How is it going to affect 5, 10 more people outside of just that one employee that's doing construction? So talking about that a little bit, I mean, what does long-term, planning for this type of economic development as a board of supervisors or staff working with staff, what goes into creating the pathway for that type of economic development?
Well, I like to look at it as like a tier of needs, right? Like we have to make sure that these companies or developments that want to locate here have everything that they need. And on the bottom of that tier is energy and water, right? Scott County is absolutely silly with the water, but the energy, as I alluded to in an earlier part of our conversation, it costs a lot to get it here. So
Right.
if we have more energy generated locally, that means we have, more availability for these businesses to locate here. Then you start going up that hierarchy of needs, right? You start looking at housing, and those type of things. And that has a very direct energy need. And that's something that I'm glad that the shared solar is going to help us enable is like it's going to help us bring people's power bills down just a little bit. It
Right.
looks like it's going to be $200 a year. But $200 a year is a lot of money when you don't have much to start out with, right?
Sure.
So that that's going to be a blessing to them. But then that also feeds into, once you get more people here, the businesses have more people that they can employ, and
Right.
then they can grow. A lot of rural development gets locked in because you can't attract people to that region. You can't attract people there. That's something that, we have to look at here. So, you go up to housing, and then after housing, you're looking at like family support, right?
Right.
Do you have good schools? Do you have childcare in your county? And that's one thing that I regret to say that Scott County hasn't done a great job at is, attracting and retaining childcare. Right now, we're without childcare in the county, and people have to drive, 30, 45 minutes to drop their kids off at daycare.
Right.
And it makes it a challenge for us to continue in that economic development. But then you get to things like that, and that's for me that's kind of the top of the economic development needs ladder that we really have to be concerned. Well, that and data. Scott County is on track. I hope they don't mind that I share this, but we are on track to become the first county in Virginia that is completely wired with fiber optic cable. That means
Wow.
every single household, I'm hoping by the end of this year, if not sometime early next year, every single household will have a gigabit fiber to the door connection. And
Wow.
that's something that you just can't find in, other communities. I lived in a pretty moderately sized town, and I couldn't get it at my or not apartment, at my house. But even now, I asked my old neighbor about it. He still can't get it. So like,
Right.
we're going we're moving forward in that
Right.
respect. So it's laying all those bricks in order to build something great on top of it.
Right. And so, you alluded to it there. Obviously, one of your main goals, it seems like, is making sure that broadband build out is completed by the end of 2025. But tell us, as we wrap up, a little bit about, looking forward for the rest of the year, for this year, your chairmanship, but also, further down the line, what are some of the goals that you are really kind of pinning to the top of the board as you look to the future for Scott County?
Yeah, so one of my top goals has been to find and attract some childcare. That is proven to be more challenging because you have to prove a need, and that's a pretty big need to have to prove. So we're working with several different folks to try and bring some more childcare back into the county. We need it. Our citizens deserve it. And if you're going to grow, you got to have that. The fiber build out, that's one of our big goals. Hopefully that gets done this year. I am beyond excited about that. That just opens up so many doors for economic development, data centers, or just, attracting more remote workers. We've got cheap land, cheap houses, and good places to build. So that's the only thing that's kind of blocked us there. And then thinking a little bit further out is like, how do we leverage all these developments that are happening, whether it's housing or energy generation? How do we leverage that to push our county forward and help us grow? Scott County has experienced a lot of headwinds because we're right next to Tennessee. Tennessee
Right.
has zero income tax. So, if there's a question of it, do you want to live in Tennessee or Virginia? You obviously say Tennessee, right? Because you're
Sure.
going you're going to get a economic benefit from that, and that's around $4,000 is what we figured the average person would save there. So, part of
Wow.
my goal over the next few years is to whittle away at that $400, right? $500 here, $200 there,
Right.
and eventually, county is just as good a place to live at as anywhere across the state line.
Right.
So that's kind of how I think about it. That's probably overly simplistic. That's how I work. And
Well, no, I think it's fair, and I think it kind of harkens back to something you had already said and noted, which is, you know proposed shared solar projects, once they're in the program, have the opportunity to participate, or play a part in saving your constituents, your community members, just a small portion of that, but of course building towards that ultimate goal of providing that economic relief to show that Scott County is just as good as across the state line in Tennessee. And all of those goals that you've set seem to they're kind of up the pyramid, right? Childcare, housing, broadband there. And at the bottom of your pyramid, the thing that holds it all together alongside water is energy, right? And so we want to see, not just in Scott County, but in the region, Southwest Virginia, up 81, across the state, we want to see more energy generation. Virginia, like we've said on the podcast before, is the number one energy importing state as of recent data. And, the only way we're going to continue to be a business attracting state is by bringing energy here and setting the stage for better infrastructure, better generation, more electrons on the grid to really allow for childcare to come along, for housing to be built, for broadband to be extended. So, Chris, very, very exciting to hear about all the things that Scott County's got going for it, and really excited to see what is coming down the line. But one of the things, we always wrap our conversations with one final question. So, if you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be and why?
Oh, well, there's only one answer for me, really, and that's Winston Churchill. I am a huge fan of Churchill. I've got all three volumes of the biography called The Last Line here on my
Yeah,
bookshelf in my office, and he's just he's a huge character, but also, when you think of Winston Churchill, you think of him during World War II, but
sure.
he was pushing uh, England forward long before that, and he made a few mistakes in his early career. He became a pariah almost. And just to see like him start to make those inroads and then come back into the light and then be there during World War
Sure.
II to kind of lead the country. I think that's an awesome story. And I just love to sit down with him and, talk to him about, how he managed to you know, bob and weave through everyone and actually get things done.
Right.
I know there was an urgency there, but still, he was able to get so much done, and he was able to bring so many people together. And he was able to bring together people on both sides of the aisle.
Right.
He had his detractors, but most everyone thought highly of him and knew that he was dedicated and going to do a good job. So it was, I think it would just be an interesting chat, and we would probably have to have at least a 4 hour long dinner for me to be satisfied and to ask
Yeah.
all the questions that I'd like to ask.
For sure. Well, Chris, that's exciting. I am, like I said, super excited to see where over the next year and even after that, Scott County is going. But really appreciate your time today. And thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, Ben, that was an excellent conversation that you just wrapped up with Supervisor Maness down in Scott County. I loved how he mentioned that every megawatt matters, and no matter where it comes from, local businesses absolutely need energy capacity in order to site new factories, new projects, new employment opportunities. Every single megawatt matters to him. What were some of your key takeaways from that conversation?
Yeah, like you, I think highlighting that every single megawatt means a job, means a dollar going to Main Street, new manufacturing facilities, talking about Tempur-Pedic. But he also really made clear, he had that expertise both in local government, but as well as software or a data engineer. He's got that experience with emerging technologies. And one of the things that I really took away from the conversation was that planning now means not just planning for the growth that we know is coming in 5 or 10 years, but really setting the stage for not just the 21st century, but the 22nd century, right? Really building out because AI and this new emerging technology is going to be with us to stay. Data centers are coming. So we've got to figure out a way to do it, address those needs, provide that energy responsibly and effectively at the local level. And the more that we can localize that energy production, those energy savings, energy investment for those local communities, the better we are off as a state, as a nation, the more steps we can take towards the future and being a leader in future technology here in America.
Yeah, I mean, it's phenomenal to see a local supervisor seeing that big picture view of our energy race with China, how we need to be competitive in the high-tech industries of the future. Too often that conversation, I think, is centered around DC, but it doesn't come down to the individual project or permitting level. But Chris gets it. He saw that opportunity. He wants to do his small part in his locality down in Southwest Virginia to fuel the state, the nation's growth. So that was phenomenal. And as we dive into our in the news segment, several exciting stories coming out of Southwest and Southern Virginia on updated grids, new projects, and advancing our energy portfolio. A recent article from Cardinal News, Matt Busey from Cardinal News just published a story updating us on Danville City's energy portfolio and some of the energy storage projects that they have cited in the past and have coming online here shortly. Danville's unique in that they have their own municipal energy system, and they're responsible for purchasing and transmitting the electricity to residents of, as they call it, Comeback City down in Danville, and that's meant two new battery energy storage systems. One that's already operational called Danville 1, and now Danville 2. Ben, walk us through some of your key takeaways there and the benefits that those projects are going to bring to the great people of Danville.
Right. So I think it's important, like you said, to note that Danville 1 came online back in 2022. I think it was sited in the late 20 teens and then came online in 2022 and has been a part of the energy mix there in Danville. I think it was about 10.5 megawatts of capacity there. The reality, if you looked at some of the comments from one of the leaders there at the local level, is that, like much of the rest of Virginia, our energy costs are rising. But Danville recognized that with this Danville 1 facility, they were able to, instead of having to increase by 10% year over year, maybe in their cost, they were able to increase by 3%. So although there wasn't a decrease immediately in customer savings, what it did allow for was not an immediate increase of this kind of exorbitant amount of money. On top of that, it's really important to note that over time, over the duration of these projects, together, they'll save roughly $70 million for the utility that will be returned to consumers. This is money that's saved in the transmission and upgrade costs that are held by the utility, and those savings are directly transferred to the consumer. The last thing that I think is important to take away, and it's important for our listeners to go and read this article at the Cardinal News. It's a great article, but at the top you'll see a photo of the existing facility. Now, in the field and online, we hear a lot, these facilities are untested, they're not safe. But what you'll realize is in Danville, they actually cited this first battery storage center right behind one of the commercial buildings in town. And then the second one's going to be sited on a former propane storage site that was owned by the city. And so these facilities not only are safe and are sited responsibly in the community, but they're tested. They've been running, they've been saving money for the utility. So it's really exciting to see the developments in Danville, and hopefully we can take this story elevated and see some more developments like this across Virginia.
Yeah, it's phenomenal to see that essentially arbitrage of energy, the Danville utilities purchasing power when it's relatively cheap and not having to pay for those huge spikes in prices that happen every so often with energy, just continuously delivering to their own energy users that lower cost. $70 million over the lifespan of these projects is nothing to balk at. And kudos to the local leaders down in Comeback City. They're experiencing a lot of growth with the new casino that's coming online there, and trying to bring back some industrial development to an area that had a lot of it prior to the last couple decades, and seeing that growth powered by new energy is just phenomenal. And Ben, to jump over to our second story, sometimes we're seeing difficulties in updating our grid because it's too difficult to buy the electricity infrastructure. Some of our supply chains were tested during COVID, and some of the limitations to our growth are not being able to get the equipment in there to install to allow for greater development of both energy producers and energy consumers, those generation plants as well as the company's manufacturing plants, neighborhoods that need these. Tell us about the Hitachi Energy investment that they recently saw in a couple counties down in Southwest Virginia and their plans for transformer manufacturing.
Yeah, so it's super exciting in my neck of the woods, just down 81, to hear about the expansion of the existing Hitachi Energy transformer manufacturing facilities. It'd be about a $22.5 million investment in two different counties in Virginia, Bland and Smith counties, and Bland and then in Adkins, which will bring on and expand each facility, hopefully to bring on about 120 new jobs. One of the things that you highlighted is, we do a lot of talk about energy generation, but energy transfer, how we move our energy around, whether it's at the local level or across the state and the region, is just as important for utilities, for producers of energy, as the actual solar or battery or natural gas facility itself. And so, like you said, during COVID, our supply chains were tested, and we had trouble getting a hold of these transformers. And residents of Southwest Virginia will know this as well as individuals in Western North Carolina. But following Hurricane Helene, we had a lot of power lines down. We needed to repair this infrastructure. And one of the issues that we had was we couldn't get enough transformers. We had enough manpower. We had trucks all over the state. We just didn't have enough transformers. And part of that is largely due to the fact that we were unable to have a good supply here due to supply chain issues. And so it's great to know that there's this investment, this innovative thinking here in Virginia, expanding this manufacturing. And that's what we want to see in this new and emerging industry, right? Is the development of this infrastructure, this technology here in the United States. Though, like we talked about earlier, we can be a leader in new technologies for the future. It's starting Southwest Virginia.
That's phenomenal. It's often said that we have a grid of the 20th century, and a grid of the 20th century is not going to be able to keep up with the growth in demand and generation of the 21st or 22nd century. So anytime we have the chance to celebrate more onshoring of manufacturing of elements of our electrical grid, we certainly want to do so. So thanks for highlighting that, Ben. Congratulations on your conversation with Supervisor Chris Maness, and thanks for all you're doing down in Southwest Virginia.
Thanks, Skyler. Thank you for joining us for the America First Energy Podcast, brought to you by Energy Right. A big thank you to Chris Maness, Chairman of the Scott County Board of Supervisors, for being our guest today. You can find our show on Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts. You can find full videos to accompany our episodes at the Energy Right YouTube page. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Ben Wilson, and Skyler Zunk, produced by Kayla Ventura, with audio and visual support from Dylan Taylor. Join us next time for the America First Energy Podcast.